In 1970s Czechoslovakia, corruption was tolerated and compromise was rewarded. And what do you do if your system is belligerent and high on its own supply? You build an alternative. And this is what Milan Lavsa, bassist for the 1970s Czechoslovakian band The Plastic People of the Universe, helped to do. What looked like a strange underground rock band was actually something far more dangerous. This wasn't a protest or rebellion, but the regime's response would unintentionally help create something remarkable. A parallel society. This is the story of how an underground rock band helped ignite the establishment of parallel institutions that rivaled and eventually replaced an authoritarian regime. After the Soviet invasion of 1968, the regime called the new era normalization. That's propaganda talk for we're doing things our way now. Bands required licenses, lyrics reviewed, cultural life centralized. The Plastics lost their professional status in 1970. But they didn't stop playing. They moved sideways. Village halls, farmhouses, private weddings used as cover. It wasn't dramatic, but it was structural. Alexis de Tocqueville, French political thinker and historian, observed that voluntary associations protect freedom by creating social trust outside the state. Under authoritarianism, those associations don't just protect liberty, they preserve it. Every underground concert became an independent civic node, a small space of autonomy, and very strange and dissonant textures that didn't vibe well with authoritarian realism. At the country cottage of playwright Václav Havel in Hradeček, artists and intellectuals gathered. This site became one of the spiritual centers of the Czech underground. And this place was hoppin'. The coolest. And not your first stepdad kinda cool, but 1976 Czech dissident kinda cool. Music mixed with philosophy. Private lectures, unfiltered conversation. This wasn't merely cultural rebellion. It was an alternative sphere of life. Years later, dissident philosopher Václav Benda would give this phenomenon a name, the parallel polis, a society developing quietly beside the official one, but at the time, no one called it that. They were just trying to breathe. And word spread quietly. And quietly, the state noticed. The Státní bezpečnost, the STB, the Czechoslovak secret police. These guys were the worst. They began documenting everything. Attendance lists, song titles, conversations after shows. There were always a few faces in the crowd who didn't quite move with the music. Too still, too observant, too off. The band always suspected that they were being surveilled. In 1976, members of the Plastic People were arrested, charged with organized disturbance of the peace. The state thought it was punishing musicians, but the trial exposed something deeper. Havel later argued in The Power of the Powerless that totalitarian systems rely on ritual compliance, public participation in official narratives. What the Plastics represented was refusal, not through slogans, but through existence. They had created a space that did not revolve around the state, and that was intolerable. And when the sentences were handed down, intellectuals were shaken. If independent culture could be criminalized, then any independent institution could be, and that realization changed strategy. Instead of confronting the state directly, what if you built around it? In January 1977, the appropriately titled Charter 77 emerged. It did not call for revolution. It asked the government to obey its own human rights commitments. Small, legal, measured, but structurally disruptive. In 1978, Václav Benda formalized what had already begun. He called it the parallel polis. The idea was simple. If official institutions are corrupted, create parallel ones. Not to overthrow, to survive. It was civic survival and moral autonomy under authoritarian control. And survival over time becomes transformation. And political theorist Max Weber wrote that authority depends not only on coercion, but legitimacy. Parallel institutions quietly drain that legitimacy and demonstrate that society can function without the regime at its center. Gene Sharp later described similar strategies as civilian-based defense, building alternative sources of power. Here are 4 examples of alternative institutions operating in Czechoslovakia under Soviet occupation. 1. Voance in 1978. The Committee for the Defense of the Unjustly Prosecuted. They documented political trials and sent reports abroad and supported victims of politically motivated persecution. It functioned as a parallel human rights monitoring institution inside a dictatorship, and it broke the secrecy that the regime relied on. Several members, including Havel, were imprisoned for this work. 2. The samizdat networks. Independent texts were typed, copied by carbon paper, and distributed privately. These included political essays, philosophy lectures, theology, and banned literature. Because official publishing was censored, samizdat became a parallel information system. It was decentralized, resilient, and trust-based. 3. Underground education. After universities were purged post-1968, philosophers lectured in apartments, theologians taught unofficial seminars, and students gathered in living rooms. These were not symbolic gestures. They maintained intellectual continuity. And 4. Cultural parallelism, underground concerts, private exhibitions, and informal gatherings, often in rural houses like Hradeček, kept artistic life alive. These spaces were surveilled, but they functioned. When protests erupted during the Velvet Revolution in 1989, the state unraveled quickly, but society did not. Why? Because civil society had been rebuilt underground. Trust networks already existed. Alternative moral authorities were known. Information channels were established. The parallel polis became the public sphere, and Havel, once hosting concerts in a cottage, became president. The government tried to silence the coolest band in Czechoslovakia. Instead, it exposed its fear. Authoritarian systems fear not only dissent, but independent association. Tocqueville saw that associations sustain liberty. Arendt saw that politics begins wherever people gather. Havel argued that living in truth fractures untruth. Benda explained how to build freedom inside unfreedom. The plastics didn't write political theory. They rehearsed it. Parallel institutions don't look dramatic. They look small. Until one day, they are the only thing standing. Let's give a big thumbs up to those artists, philosophers, and dissidents who refuse to accept abusive and oppressive regimes, despite having the full force of the state waged against them.